What happens when a Hollywood legend finally decides she's had enough of being interrupted and pushes back against one of the most outspoken voices on daytime television? What you're about to hear is one of the most intense exchanges ever to unfold on The View, a moment when Jane Fonda delivered a response so sharp that the entire studio fell into stunned silence, and the person on the receiving end, none other than longtime host Joy Behar. By the end of the conversation, the tension was so thick. You could practically feel it through the screen. And viewers everywhere were asking the same question. Did this interview go too far? Before we dive into the moment that shocked the studio, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story takes a turn no one saw coming. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning. The studio lights were bright, the audience had taken their seats, and the hosts of The View were preparing to welcome their guest of the day. That guest was a name recognized around the world. Jane Fonda. 86 years old, Fonda had experienced nearly every chapter Hollywood could offer. From rising to fame as a young starlet in the golden age of cinema, to becoming a passionate political activist, to inspiring millions as a fitness icon, decades of success had made her not only famous, but fearless. And on that morning, she had arrived at the show to discuss her latest project. But what no one in the studio expected was how quickly the conversation would shift as Jane Fonda stepped onto the set. The audience erupted into applause. Many even stood to greet her. She looked elegant and composed, dressed in a crisp white blazer, her silver hair styled perfectly, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent more than 60 years in the spotlight. When she took her seat at the table, it felt like the arrival of true Hollywood royalty. "Welcome back to The View, Jane," said Whoopi Goldberg, smiling warmly. "It's always wonderful having you here." "Thank you," Jane replied graciously. "It's lovely to be back." For a brief moment, everything seemed perfectly friendly, but then the tone shifted. Before Jane had even fully settled into conversation, Joy Behar leaned forward, and she didn't hold back. "So, Jane," Joy began, "I have to ask something that's been bothering me." Her voice carried the unmistakable edge viewers had come to expect. "You've been very outspoken about climate change and activism, but isn't that a bit hypocritical coming from someone who's spent decades flying on private jets and living in huge mansions?" The words landed heavily across the table. The studio suddenly felt different, the kind of silence that follows a question everyone knows might spark something bigger, and for a brief moment, no one moved. "Welcome back to The View, Jane," said Whoopi Goldberg with genuine warmth. "It's always a pleasure to have you here." "Thank you for having me," replied Jane Fonda, smiling calmly. "It's wonderful to be here." For a brief moment, everything seemed perfectly friendly, but that calm atmosphere didn't last long. Before Jane had even settled comfortably into her seat, Joy Behar leaned forward, clearly ready to jump straight into the conversation. "So, Jane," Joy began, "I have to ask you something that's been bothering me. You've been very vocal about climate activism lately." The other hosts exchanged uneasy glances. Something about the tone of the question immediately felt different. Jane noticed it too. "Well, Joy," she responded carefully, her voice still composed but carrying a subtle edge, "that's certainly an interesting way to begin an interview." She paused briefly before continuing. "I've always been open about my past and about the changes I've made in my life. Over the years, I've worked hard to reduce my environmental impact, and I've used my platform to raise awareness about climate change." For a moment, it seemed like the conversation might move forward, but Joy wasn't ready to let it go. Leaning further across the table, she pushed the point even harder. "But come on, Jane," Joy insisted, her voice growing sharper. "You still own mansions. You've lived a very luxurious life." The room suddenly felt heavier. The question lingered in the air, like something toxic. "You can't just say you've changed and expect people to forget the lifestyle you've enjoyed for decades," Joy continued. "You're asking everyday people to make sacrifices while you're still living very comfortably." Around the studio, the audience began shifting in their seats. Everyone could sense the tension rising. "Don't you see the conflict there?" Joy pressed. For a split second, the entire set seemed to hold its breath. Jane Fonda's expression slowly changed. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and in that quiet moment everyone in the room recognized the same fiery determination that had defined her decades-long career as both an actress and an activist. Something told them this conversation was about to take a very different turn, and what happened next, no one in the studio was prepared for. "You can't talk about change," Joy Behar continued, pressing her point, "and expect people to forget that you've lived a very lavish lifestyle for years. You're asking everyday people to make sacrifices while you're still living comfortably. Don't you see the contradiction there?" A quiet murmur spread through the audience. The tension in the studio was suddenly impossible to ignore. The other hosts exchanged uneasy looks. It was clear the conversation had moved far beyond a typical interview. For a brief moment, Jane Fonda remained silent. Her expression shifted slightly, not angry, but focused. Then she spoke. "Well, Joy," Jane said calmly, though the firmness in her voice was unmistakable, "that's quite a way to begin an interview." She paused just long enough for the room to settle. "I've always been transparent about my past and the changes I've made. Over the years, I've taken real steps to reduce my carbon footprint, and I've used my platform to bring attention to climate issues." For a second, it looked like the conversation might cool down, but Joy leaned forward again, clearly unsatisfied. "But come on, Jane." "Joy," Jane interrupted gently but firmly, "I'm not entirely sure what you're trying to accomplish here." The studio grew very quiet. "Are you interviewing me about the work I'm doing now?" Jane continued. "Or are you trying to create a dramatic moment for television?" She tilted her head slightly, "Because if it's the second option, I think you're approaching it the wrong way." The reaction around the table was immediate. Joy's face flushed red, clearly surprised by the pushback. "I'm just asking the questions viewers want answered," she replied defensively. Jane didn't raise her voice, but the strength in her tone was undeniable. "There's a difference," Jane said slowly, "between honest journalism and being unnecessarily confrontational." The entire table had fallen silent. The other hosts looked stunned as the exchange unfolded in front of them. Sunny Hostin looked as though she might step in to redirect the conversation, while Sara Haines nervously shuffled through her notes. But no one spoke, because everyone could feel it. The interview had crossed into something far more intense than anyone had expected, and the moment was only getting bigger. The expression on Whoopi Goldberg's face was difficult to read. She sat quietly watching the tension unfold, but her posture suggested she was ready to step in if things escalated any further. Sensing the pressure building around her, Joy Behar decided to push back. "Well, I'm sorry if you can't handle tough questions, Jane," Joy said sharply. "But this is The View. We don't do soft interviews here." The remark instantly changed the atmosphere. For a moment, the room went still. Then Jane Fonda slowly straightened in her chair. Her calm demeanor remained, but there was now a sharp intensity in her eyes that reminded everyone exactly why she had dominated both Hollywood and public discourse for decades. "Tough questions," Jane repeated. Her voice was steady, but every word cut through the air with precision. "Joy, you call that journalism?" The audience leaned forward. "You opened this interview with accusations that weren't even properly researched," Jane continued. "And you didn't give me a real opportunity to explain anything. That's not tough journalism." She paused briefly. "That's tabloid behavior." A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Jane wasn't finished yet. "And if you had done even a little research before this interview," Jane continued, "you would know that I've been living in a much smaller home for years. I stopped using private jets for personal travel a long time ago. And I've donated millions of dollars to environmental organizations." Her gaze stayed fixed. "But you didn't bother to check any of that, did you?" The studio fell completely silent. Even the audience seemed unsure how to react. Joy looked momentarily stunned that Jane was pushing back so directly. For a brief second, she stumbled over her words while trying to regain control. "Well, I think our viewers deserve to know about these contradictions," Joy said, though the confidence in her voice had clearly faded. Jane leaned back slightly in her chair. A small, knowing smile appeared at the corner of her lips. "What viewers deserve, Joy," she said calmly, "is honest and respectful conversation, not whatever this performance is supposed to be." The word performance landed like a shockwave. Joy's face shifted instantly, from flushed red to pale. She glanced around the table, almost as if searching for backup from her co-hosts, but none of them spoke. Sunny Hostin looked down at her notes. Sara Haines avoided eye contact. Joy was suddenly standing alone in the confrontation. "I don't know what you're implying," Joy said defensively, her voice rising slightly. Jane's response came immediately, calm, controlled, and unmistakably clear. "I'm not implying anything," Jane replied coolly. "I'm stating it." "I'm not implying anything," Jane Fonda said calmly. "I'm stating it clearly. Right now you're performing, trying to create conflict where none needs to exist. And honestly, Joy, that's beneath both of us." The words hung in the air. For the first time since the interview began, Joy Behar looked visibly shaken. What had started as an aggressive line of questioning had now turned into something very different, and the balance of control in the conversation had clearly shifted. Joy had entered the interview expecting to challenge a Hollywood icon. Instead, she was being dismantled by someone who had spent decades navigating far more intense public battles than a morning talk show debate. "Well, Jane," Joy tried again, forcing a thin smile, "I'm simply trying to hold you accountable for your actions." Jane let out a short laugh, the kind that carried more disbelief than amusement. Hold me accountable, she repeated. Joy, you're a talk show host, not a prosecutor. And even if you were, the first rule would be to get your facts straight before making accusations. A ripple of reaction moved through the audience. The tension inside the View studio had become almost tangible, the kind you could feel without a single word being spoken. The cameras continued rolling as the uncomfortable moments stretched on. Finally, Whoopi Goldberg leaned forward, clearly trying to redirect the conversation before things escalated further. Maybe we should talk about your new project, Jane, Whoopi suggested carefully. IT was an obvious lifeline. But instead of taking the opportunity to move on, Joy made a decision that only intensified the moment. No, wait, Joy said, raising her hand slightly. I think we should address this properly. The room went quiet again. Jane, Joy continued, you've built a career around controversy. From your time speaking out about Vietnam to your political activism, you've never shied away from stirring strong reactions. So why are you suddenly so sensitive when someone questions those actions? The comment landed like a shockwave. For a brief moment, no one in the studio moved as Jane's expression changed, shifting from controlled frustration to something far more serious. Sensitive, she repeated quietly. Her voice was low now, almost dangerously calm. Joy, Jane said, you seem to be confusing controversy with ignorance. The audience held its breath. What you just said, she continued, shows that you don't fully understand the history you're referencing. But Joy pressed forward, convinced she was gaining ground. You're talking about your anti-war protests, Joy said. Your comments about American soldiers. You can't rewrite history, Jane. The room froze. Even the crew behind the cameras stopped moving. For a moment, Jane sat perfectly still. Then she spoke again, her voice steady, precise, and sharper than before. Joy, she said, I'm going to give you one opportunity to retract that statement and apologize. Her eyes never left Joy's, because what you just said isn't just inaccurate, it's deliberately inflammatory. And it disrespects not only me, but the veterans I've worked alongside for decades. The seriousness of the moment was undeniable, but instead of stepping back, Joy made another move. I don't need to apologize for stating facts, Joy replied. Your actions during Vietnam are well documented. Slowly, Jane stood up from her chair. For a second, it looked as though she might simply walk off the set. But instead, she turned to face Joy directly, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had spent a lifetime standing her ground in far tougher arenas. Facts. Jane said quietly, let's talk about facts. Let me give you some facts, Joy, Jane Fonda said, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. I spent 2 full years visiting wounded veterans in hospitals. I've worked with veteran organizations for more than 5 decades. I've publicly apologized many times for the pain my past actions may have caused. And for years, I've dedicated time and resources to supporting troops and veterans. She paused, letting the words settle across the silent studio. But you wouldn't know any of that, Jane continued, because you didn't bother to research it before opening this conversation. Across the table, Joy Behar looked stunned. The confidence she'd carried at the start of the interview had faded completely. Well, I mean, that may be true, Joy stammered. But the perception is still there. Jane's response came immediately. Perception built on half-truths, she said. The kind of half-truths people repeat because they think it makes good television. I wasn't throwing around accusations, Joy protested weakly. Yes, you were, Jane replied without hesitation. From the moment I sat down, you've been presenting assumptions as facts, asking loaded questions, and trying to reopen debates about history you clearly haven't studied properly. She leaned slightly forward. This isn't journalism, Joy. This is a hit job. Around the table, the other hosts looked deeply uncomfortable. Sonny Hostin stared down at her hands, clearly uneasy with the direction the conversation had taken. Sara Haines sat frozen with her notes, unsure whether to speak, and Whoopi Goldberg appeared to be quietly calculating how to steer the show away from the unfolding disaster. But Joy, now visibly struggling, made one final attempt to regain control. I think you're overreacting, Jane, she said nervously. This is just a normal interview. For a moment, Jane simply stared at her. Then, she let out a short laugh, a laugh filled with disbelief. Normal? Jane repeated, shaking her head. Joy, in a normal interview, the host researches the guest. They ask thoughtful questions that help the audience learn something meaningful. And they actually listen to the answers they receive. She paused again. You've done none of those things. I did prepare, Joy said defensively. Not even close, Jane answered firmly. If you had prepared, you'd know that for the past decade I've been working on climate change documentaries. You'd know that I've been arrested multiple times while protesting environmental destruction. And you know that I've personally funded renewable energy initiatives. Her voice grew stronger as she continued, but instead of discussing any of that meaningful work, you chose to ambush me with questions that belong in a gossip column. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She looked completely lost, as if the conversation had slipped far beyond her control. And another thing, Jane continued, her momentum building. Your approach here isn't just unprofessional, it's lazy. The audience remained completely silent, hanging on every word. You had the opportunity today, Jane said, to have an interesting conversation about how entertainment and activism intersect, about how Hollywood has changed, about the challenges women face in this industry as they grow older. She looked directly across the table. Instead, you tried to manufacture drama because you think drama makes good television. Some members of the audience nodded quietly. Others looked stunned by the intensity of the moment unfolding live. Finally, Joy managed to speak again, but her voice was barely above a whisper. Before she could finish, Jane gently sat back in her chair, never breaking eye contact. No, Jane said calmly, you weren't trying to have a conversation. She paused. You were trying to score cheap points. The words hung over the View studio like a heavy cloud. Joy sat there silently, looking smaller than she had just minutes earlier. She had begun the interview believing she would expose someone else's contradictions, but by the end of the exchange, it was her own lack of preparation and professionalism that had been revealed. And just when it seemed the confrontation might finally calm down, Jane Fonda continued. Her voice remained steady, but every word carried unmistakable weight. The way you handled this interview, Jane said slowly, reveals far more about you than it does about me. The studio was completely silent. You've shown your viewers that creating drama appears to matter more to you than having a thoughtful conversation with your guests. Across the table, Joy Behar attempted one last effort to defend herself, but Jane leaned forward slightly, the movement graceful, controlled, and quietly commanding. Joy, she continued, there's an important difference between asking tough questions and simply being rude. She paused. What you've been doing today isn't investigative or challenging. It's combative for the sake of being combative. The silence that followed felt almost overwhelming. Joy sat frozen in her chair, as if trying to process how quickly the conversation had slipped out of her control. But Jane wasn't finished. Decades of experience in interviews, debates, and public scrutiny had prepared her for moments exactly like this, and she was about to bring the exchange to its final turning point. You know what the real tragedy is here, Joy, Jane said calmly. Her tone softened slightly, but the steel behind her words remained. You had the opportunity to have a meaningful discussion with someone who has lived through more than 7 decades of American history, someone who has witnessed the evolution of the entertainment industry, someone who has stood on the front lines of social movements. She paused, looking directly across the table, and instead, you chose to waste that opportunity with this performance. Joy's face had drained of color. She glanced around the table as if hoping for support, but her co-hosts avoided eye contact. Sunny Hostin remained focused on her notes. Sara Haines sat quietly, clearly uncomfortable, and Whoopi Goldberg watched the moment unfold with careful restraint that it was clear. Joy was facing the consequences alone. Finally, Joy spoke again, her voice now quiet, stripped of the earlier confidence. I think maybe we should move on. Jane raised an eyebrow. Oh, now you want to move on, she replied, and a few audience members shifted in their seats. After 10 minutes of accusations and misinformation, suddenly changing the subject seems very convenient. The audience sat on the edge of their seats. What had begun as a routine segment on The View had transformed into something entirely different, a powerful demonstration of how a seasoned guest can confront a hostile interview. Jane leaned forward again, her expression thoughtful but firm. Joy, let me ask you something. Her question hung in the air. When you prepared for this interview, what exactly were you hoping to accomplish? Joy opened her mouth, but no answer came. Were you hoping to expose hypocrisy? Jane continued. Did you expect me to lose my composure under pressure? Another pause. What was the end goal here? Joy remained silent. From the audience, the tension was palpable. Because from where I'm sitting, Jane went on, it seems you invited me here not for an honest conversation, but to use me as a prop for a story you had already decided to tell. Her next word landed like a thunderclap. That's not journalism, Joy. Jane paused. That's exploitation. The accusation hung in the air like a shockwave. Joy's hands trembled slightly as she searched for a response. I never intended, she began, but Jane gently raised a hand, stopping her. Joy, she said calmly, her tone almost maternal now. Listen carefully. I've been doing interviews for more than 60 years. Her voice remained composed, but every word carried quiet authority. I've faced aggressive reporters, political opponents, angry crowds, and hostile executives. She looked directly at Joy, and you are none of those things. You're not a prosecutor, Jane Fonda continued, her voice calm but cutting through the silence of the studio. You're a talk show host who believed you could score points by being rude to an elderly guest. She paused, and that's not just unprofessional, it's sad. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The word sad landed with surprising force, not loud, not dramatic, but delivered with such quiet authority that it felt heavier than any raised voice. Across the table, Joy Behar looked stunned, as though the comment had struck her physically. Sensing the situation had reached a breaking point, Whoopi Goldberg finally stepped in. Jane, Whoopi said carefully, we appreciate you being here today. Maybe we should wrap this segment up. Jane raised her hand politely. Actually, Whoopi, if I may finish the point I was making. Her eyes briefly shifted toward Joy. Joy began this conversation. I think she deserves to hear how it ends. Joy sank deeper into her chair, clearly wishing the moment would simply disappear. But Jane wasn't finished. Joy, you mentioned earlier that I've been a controversial figure throughout my career. Jane said. She nodded slightly, and you're absolutely right about that. The audience leaned in, but there's a difference, Jane continued, between being controversial because you stand up for something you believe in, and being controversial because you don't know how to behave professionally. She paused, letting the distinction settle across the room. When I protested the war in Vietnam, when I spoke out for women's rights, when I advocated for environmental protection, Jane's voice remained steady. I knew people would disagree with me. I knew I would face criticism. She looked directly at Joy, and I accepted that criticism because I believed in the causes I was fighting for. Then her tone sharpened slightly, but what happened here today isn't brave. It isn't principled. And it certainly isn't meaningful debate. Another pause. What happened here today, Jane said firmly, was simply rudeness, motivated by the belief that conflict makes good television. The audience remained completely silent. After a moment, Joy finally spoke, but her voice was barely louder than a whisper. I'm sorry if you felt that I was rude. Jane responded immediately. I don't feel that you were rude, Joy. Her gaze never shifted. You were rude. She paused once more. That's not a feeling. That's a fact.